Welcome to the Dawn to Dusk podcast with your host, Douglas Wood, author of From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. In each episode, Doug speaks with distinguished legal professionals who have mastered the intricacies of building a successful law practice and then transitioning to retirement or other fulfilling pursuits when the right time comes. Now, let's join Doug for today's insightful discussion.
I'm Doug Wood. Welcome to this episode of From Dawn to Dusk. My guest today is Stu Shanus, a veteran trial lawyer who has navigated one of the most interesting and, in many ways, most demanding transitions in the legal profession, from advocate to neutral. For decades, Stu built a distinguished career as a litigator, representing clients in complex, high-stakes disputes. Like many trial lawyers, he lived in a world defined by strategy, persuasion, and winning. In 2016, sensing he was burned out by big law, a client asked Stu to help him run his family office, which led to Stu becoming the president of a patent licensing company and then the chief legal officer of a defense technology startup. While he always enjoyed devising and executing legal strategies, he realized his greatest professional satisfaction came from helping people solve their legal problems. So in January 2026, he stepped away from advocacy and into the world of mediation and arbitration, where success looks very different. Today, Stu is a full-time neutral, helping parties resolve disputes not by defeating one another, but by finding a path forward. It's a role that requires a different kind of judgment, one grounded not just in legal skill, but in listening, patience, and understanding of human dynamics. He's also been thinking and writing about the evolving challenges facing lawyers today, including the growing impact of AI on intellectual property and dispute resolution, issues that are not only reshaping how disputes are resolved, but how they arise in the first place. In our conversation today, we'll explore Stu's journey through the lens of dawn to dusk, how he built his litigation practice, what led him to step away from it, and what he's learned about conflict, persuasion, and resolution at the other side of the table. Stu, welcome to the show. So, let's get to some questions to you, and we'll get started here. So, Stu, take us back in time. Tell us, what is it that got Stu into becoming a lawyer, and what motivated you in that regard?
Well, before I jump on your question, Doug, thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. I was totally flattered when I got your email and was like, wow, that not only is it great to hear from former colleagues anytime, but I was thrilled that you reached out to me and quite frankly humbled that anyone would be interested in what I had to say about anything. So I totally appreciate it. And I also have to say I loved your book. I thought it was terrific, and I thought it was a love letter to young lawyers, honest, encouraging, and I kind of wish I had it when I was, 35 years ago when I was just starting out. So thank you, and much appreciated. And I hope anybody who's out there who has a chance to listen to you on your podcast, grab the book and read it. It's a great read, especially for younger lawyers. And I think for those of us on the other side, there's a lot of great lessons in there too. So thank you for that. Interesting. I was an accidental lawyer, right? I think this story is not uncommon. But when I was an undergrad, I looked at the jobs my friends were getting. I'm like, I don't want to do that. And I had a lot of student loans. And someone said, if you stay in school, you don't have to pay your student loans back right away. Well, that's interesting. And so I was like, I guess I'll apply to law school. Let's see what's that all about. And I decided that I thought I would be a public policy junkie, like kind of go to Washington, D.C. and work on the Hill. That was kind of my what I first thought I would do. And as I got exposed to that world, I was like, this isn't for me. I don't really enjoy this. And then probably second year in law school, trial advocacy, I stood up and got to present, kind of a mock case in front of a mock jury. And I was like, this is for me. More of this, please. And that was it. I just decided that's what I was going to dedicate my professional life to, and took off on that journey and kind of never really looked back. I mean, I think being an advocate, being in the courtroom was always my first love. And I miss it a little bit. But what I don't miss is kind of the general practice of law. And then as I got more mature into my practice, I realized, really what we're doing is helping people resolve their disputes, right? In other words, it's our system is set up where you have this advocacy and each side kind of trying to beat each other's brains out in the courthouse, but always in the back of your mind, you're looking for the off-ramp, right? You're trying to position your client to get them a resolution that they can live with. And I realized that's really what I was enjoying. Even more than the advocacy and standing up, I really thought I was helping somebody solve a problem that was keeping them up at night. It could have been a bet the company case for a small client, or a case that, an in-house lawyer, a job or promotion might have depended upon the outcome. And so I was just empathetic to that and saying, well, how can I help? Right? How can I help solve your problem? And so when I kind of fully embraced that, I realized, well, that's really what I was enjoying more than kind of the general advocacy and the performance art of being a trial lawyer. And so that's where I kind of ended up, and that's where I am now. And I think of everything I did up to this point prepared me for where I am right now. I don't think I could have done this 10 years ago. I don't think I was ready.
So let's go back a little in time. And so you started out, you fell in love with litigation in law school and pursued it when you started practicing, with the idea that you wanted to solve problems, obviously, as opposed to just create them, like so many other litigators tend to do.
Oh, I created a fair bunch myself. Yeah, trust me.
How did you take that approach that you had in litigation to actually build a practice, to attract clients, and to become the success that you were?
One of the things that struck me in your book was the fact that lawyers don't like to market, and I'm 100% guilty of that. And even to this day, I'm not a natural marketer. It's not something I really enjoy doing. And so I was lucky enough that marketing, I joke, with me at kind of being in big law was answering my phone, right? I felt like what I had to offer was jumping into difficult situations and being there 100% for whether it was the senior partner or then ultimately the client. And I think looking back on it, that's what clients were attracted to me about. I think that they could sense that I may have cared more about their issue even than they did, and that I was going to die trying for them. And so kind of the marketing approach was, I think, just putting myself in that situation over and over and over again, right? And just trying to never take the case or the client for granted, and just kind of being there, whenever they needed me, whether that was nights or weekends or unfortunately vacations interrupted. But that was the nature of what I did. And, as you said in your book, support from my wife and family who were like, they understood this was just the nature of what I did. So it was a different approach than what you described. And I wish I had a lot more of what you had developed as a skill as a young lawyer, or like I said, someone had coached me about what I would call more external marketing, but it wasn't something that I spent a whole lot of time on. And when I did, I wasn't very good at it. And I think I half-assed it because I didn't like it. Right?
Well, one thing you certainly didn't half-ass was the success you had over the many years that you were an active litigator. And I know you spent inordinate amounts of hours at work on weekends and nights and et cetera, that most litigators have to do, and sometimes in spurts and fits and starts, and a kind of a crazy professional lifestyle. So how did you balance that with your personal life and your family life? How did you find some balance?
With a lot of struggle, right, and a lot of help, and making some mistakes along the way. But I think I set some boundaries. I'll tell you one that I lived by once I had kids. I would take the last flight out of wherever I was to get home that night, no matter how late it was, so that when I woke up in the morning, I was there for my I have two sons. I was there for my boys when they were young. And my wife would be like, "What are you doing? You're killing yourself. Why don't you just fly out tomorrow morning?" I'm like, "No." I would tell clients or whatever the last flight out was, I was on it. And so even if I dragged into the house at 1 a.m, I knew when my boys woke up, I'd be there. Right. And so that was one of the things that I did. And I also was unapologetic about if there was something that my boys were participating in, I would go. right? And I'd say, oh, I'm going to be out of the office for now. I'm going to a Little League game. Okay. I'll be back. Like, if it was an absolute emergency, obviously you don't do it. But I think it was just a matter of picking your spots, making it a priority, letting everybody know that's what I was doing, and being unapologetic about it. Like, not making an excuse, not saying, oh, I have a doctor's appointment, or I haven't. No, I'd be like, no, I'm going to my kid's Little League game. Right, I'll be back in an hour.
Your observation that reminds me of something a client once told me that helped me have that same attitude that you did vis-a-vis your children. He made the comment that it's not the events and occurrences that you go to that they remember, it's the ones you didn't go to that they remember.
That's
And
interesting.
that's so true in terms of with kids, that you don't want to disappoint them by not being
Right.
there. And when you're there, they kind of assume you're there. Hey, it's dad. He's there. Great. But when he's
Yeah.
not there, they really do remember that. So that's a great piece of advice that you've given in terms of how to find that balance. Because lawyers often have great difficulty balancing their professional and their personal lives. I've seen that all too often in the years that I manage lawyers.
I,
It's really
I,
not necessary if they set up boundaries.
yeah, and I agree. I think that I learned from some mentors to just, it's just brutally honest, right? In other words, don't be so insecure. I mean, yes, clients have kids, clients have parents and issues, and just tell them, like, this is what I'm doing. I think they respect it, right? In other words, I think they respect you because they know in your persona, when they spoke to me, they knew I was being honest with them about everything, right? About their case, about what I was up to, about what was happening. And I think they just over time learned that if, they may not like what I had to say, but they knew it was coming from a place of caring. And, that was my best advice, right? I was never in the BS business with clients, right? That
Well,
just,
let's
I didn't
pursue
have that. I didn't have that gene.
let's pursue that observation a little bit longer, a little further, because I find that fascinating observation. So, as a litigator, you had to deal with very difficult clients who were in a mess or whatever, who may have done something wrong, who may have deserved to be sued or not
Mm-hmm.
deserved to be defended, etc. In your experience, how did you deal with those difficult clients? How did you interact with them?
Um, I think a lot of listening, a lot of trying to be empathetic to their situation, to understand the pressures that they were under, to understand what it is that they were trying to accomplish. And if I couldn't reach them, right, in other words, they were just difficult and they were going to be difficult, then I think I almost looked at it. I'm not a doctor, but the way a doctor might treat, kind of an ailment, like the ailment is the issue, right? In other words, the client's problem was what I was trying to solve, personality aside. And then you have to kind of let the water run off, duck's ass and say, well, this person's difficult. Let them get out whatever venom they need to get out, whether they're yelling at me or upset, and then just get back to the issue at hand, which was their legal issue, the facts that were driving that and what the strategy was, and then just be kind of resolute and say, this is what I'm doing. So it was never enjoyable, but then you really focused on, the client's legal problem was what I was actually there to do. And if I couldn't take care of their personal issues, so be it. It's not enjoyable, right? That's the time when you realize, yeah, you're getting highly compensated to do this, and it's miserable. Oftentimes when you have a client who isn't appreciative or is difficult, but you realize, that's the life we chose.
It's interesting. I once had a law school professor who started off a class with a hypothetical saying, you're in a conference room and you're sitting beside the person that hired you as their lawyer. Across the table is the other person who hired that lawyer on the other side of the table as their lawyer. How many clients are in the room? So we looked and said, well, what kind of a stupid question is this? And somebody raised their hand and said, there's two. And he goes, wrong. And so then another kid raised his hand and says, well, there's one, is mine. The only one I care about is mine. The professor said, wrong. So we all sit there staring at what he says, there's three. There's your client, there's the other client, and there's the deal that they're in the room to get done. And if you ever lose sight that you're there to resolve something, as opposed to just do whatever your client wants you to do, you're never going to be a good lawyer. And that's something I always remembered as a transactional lawyer. I wasn't a litigator. But that same kind of concept you were talking about just now, that, as difficult as the client may be, they want a resolution. And that's your job, is to get the resolution. So that's a really excellent observation.
I wish your professor would talk to clients more. I mean, part of one of the things I really didn't like, and these were the clients I had the hardest time dealing with, you would try to be the voice of reason and say, look, we go to trial. Okay, here's the percentage chance of winning. Here what the issues are. Here's the resolution. And oftentimes when you did that, I can't tell you how many times, more than a handful, clients would say to me, well, whose lawyer are you anyway? Like as if I wasn't fighting hard enough for them. And my job is more than just simply standing up in the courtroom and presenting the best argument I can come up with in front of the judge, right? Isn't it to kind of help you get out of this mess that you're in, right? Whether it's being imposed on you by the other side, or to your point, whether it was a self-inflicted wound, right? I always thought the least skilled litigator was the one who could just try the case. Because any decent lawyer knows how to try a case. You know what the rules of procedure are. You know what the facts are. You get up, you make the case. You try to persuade the jury to rule in your favor. It doesn't take a whole lot of tactical issues to do that. The harder part, the really hard part, is convincing your client and the opposing lawyer of what the best deal is, right? That's the skill. Right, using all of your tools as a trial lawyer to position it to make sure everybody understands where the exit ramp is, right, as best you can. Now it's client's decision, but I always laugh a little bit at lawyers who market themselves, say, "Oh, we don't settle cases, we just try cases." And I go, "Well, okay, but that's not very difficult. That's easy, right?" Okay.
So I'm going to want to get back to that when we get into what you're doing now, but before that whole attitude you just talked about, but before we get there, at some point, a client, in your case, a client observed that you might be burning out in big law, and that offered you the position with the family practice that he had. What were some of did you see any signs? What advice would you give to lawyers out there now who are sort of, they're at a point of inflection where they're not quite sure, whether maybe they feel a little burnout, whatever it is. What were some of the signs that you saw, and how did you deal with them?
In reverse order, not very well. I didn't deal with it very well. In retrospect, I found myself spending more time thinking about and becoming anxious about things that were internal to the law firm, as opposed to the issues that my clients were facing and the legal, strategies, which I still to this day enjoy trying to help problems. I spent more time and more of my own energy about what was going on internally at the law firm and what I saw as, either inequities toward me or to others, or to the way the business was going. And I was part of the management, team as you were, and it just was eating me up, right? And the idea that there were too many voices. I didn't think people were particularly focused on the business in a way that I thought was important, and that just consumed me, and I couldn't let it go. And that was, to me, that was the beginning of the end. Like I can't do this. And I think at that point I realized I wanted to be part of a team where everybody was pulling or rowing in the same direction. And I think that's what I found when the client who kind of coaxed me out was the idea of being part of something where everybody was focused on one result, which was, kind of to move the business forward, and could have open and honest discussions about that and how to succeed in business, as opposed to, the immense politics that goes on at a huge, big law firm, right? That just wasn't for me.
I believe me, I feel that pain.
And I think your book did a great job of explaining that, in terms of it was a great window when you were talking about, when you decided that it was time to transition, and the friction that you had to overcome in order to try to get somebody even to listen to you, right, and to kind of engage. And but your experience in that, like I said, is a window into that. But it wasn't unique in the sense that you were the only one who kind of fighting the problem. I felt like that permeated lots of different issues. I'm sure that young lawyers would say they had the same experience, and kind of lawyers in the prime of their career or on the way up had the same issue, right? It's a very, very difficult thing to do in such a large organization when people care so much, and you cared and I cared. And I think in a weird psychological way, that's what burnt me out, right? I wish I had the gene to say, so what?
Yeah.
It's just not part of my nature. Like, I feel like if everybody isn't working to try to do what's best for the organization, the best for everybody, I get frustrated. I realize, okay, that's my issue, right? I can't impose that on everybody. And so the best result really is for me to exit stage left.
So tell us, so one day you get this phone call from a client saying, okay, Stu, come on board. I want you out of there. You're burning out in big law. How did you feel? What was your reaction?
I think it's the first time I probably had an 8-hour night's sleep in probably about 10 years, right? Because I just didn't realize how much it was consuming me. I think my wife knew, right? Because she was very encouraging once it kind of came on. And once I made the decision, I remember the feeling of just kind of relief, right? And that, just being swimming up against the stream or fighting it for so long is just absolutely exhausting. And both, kind of mentally and physically. And I remember the sense of like, wow, I'm going to do this, and had, no regrets, like just couldn't believe my good fortune to have an opportunity to do something like that. So it was, I don't know if it's what they say, time makes the man, whatever that expression is. I don't know whether or not it was pure luck or I'd been looking and putting out that kind of energy, and the client recognized it, and him being a smart business guy kind of recognized that, I think there's an opportunity here. So
what's interesting in your observation is that many lawyers fear to make that leap. They get caught up in the inertia of a large organization or even a small law firm. It doesn't really matter the size of it, and it's almost like they're Linus in the security blanket. They don't want to let it go because they're fearful of what's going to be on the other side. But there are so many stories of folks who have taken that leap, like you have, and others have, where they found, in fact, there is greener grass on the other side if you just take that leap forward. So, how did you find the transition from a big, huge organization with layers and layers and layers of management and alleged support, whatever you wanted, to going into a small environment? How did you cope with that change?
It's a really interesting question. It's something I really hadn't thought about in a bit. I remember struggling a little bit with the lack of support, right? In other words, the one thing that big firms are good at with partners is I always had an amazing legal assistant. It was probably one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. She was just brilliant and hardworking, and she anticipated what I needed before I think I even knew what it was, right? And then I went into an organization that was much flatter and without that support, and I had to try to figure it out on my own. So you're a little lost, and you're kind of doing everything kind of on your own. But at some level, then I kind of learned to enjoy that a little bit, kind of the challenge of just kind of keeping everything calendars yourself, or calling people yourself, or doing anything administrative, and just kind of doing it kind of mostly on my own. I kind of learned to embrace it, because the flip side was I didn't have the bureaucracy to deal with too. So it was an interesting transition. So
having made that transition, and now you're in a smaller environment practicing, both as an officer in the company, obviously, and also then as the chief legal officer. What were some of the litigation skills that you had that you brought to that made that work for you?
I think litigators are very, very good at understanding risk and how to mitigate it. And I think what we see, because I had a broad-based practice, even in trying to knit together some transactions or looking at diligence, you kind of get a very keen eye for kind of what I would call kind of hidden risks that even the business or the deal guys don't see, right? Because you've seen so many things blow up for so many reasons, and you start to have you develop, a nose kind of your olfactory sense. You kind of smell it, right? And you're like, oh, wait a minute. I've kind of seen something like this before, and how to get out in front of it and either mitigate it or realize, oh no, this isn't going to get better, right? Like this is something you had to go to my then partner and say, yep, no, I would avoid this at all costs, right? This isn't something you can fix or I can fix. The better thing to do is walk away. Or you did find a way to mitigate the risk and move forward. And that took a little bit of I think that was probably the most difficult part of the transition from being a litigator to being what I would call more of a business oriented lawyer.
That reminds me of a story years ago when I was a young associate. I was given an assignment. It was a client who had a trademark infringement issue and disparagement issue. So I did this memo and basically told the client we could really kick ass on this other, against this guy. We could crush him and whatever that kind of stuff. So I called him up and after he got the memo, and he said, very good memo, Doug, but you missed the entire point. So I said, okay, here we go. What did I do now? So I said, well, what was the point? He goes, you didn't address whether this is hurting us. This is just an annoyance. And we're not going to come out with nuclear weapons for an annoyance. So you've got to keep that perspective. Then you're giving advice to a client, he would say to me, or he said to me, keep your advice geared to what that risk is and what the problem really is, not that you're not there to be some kind of a gladiator every single time. It's like another client once said to me when he turned us down on a case, he said, Doug, when I need a Rolls Royce, I'll come to you. When I need a Volkswagen, I'm going someplace else.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's that kind of approach to remembering what the risk and, like you say, the risk levels are. You're absolutely right about litigators. I was always amazed I was not a litigator. I was a transaction lawyer. But litigators amazed me in two things. One, they were really good at analyzing risk. And the other thing they were really good at was learning something they never knew before really fast and then forgetting it again until they had to learn it again. I mean, it's amazing talent that people like yourself, litigators, have. Now,
well, yeah, it's funny you say that because that's what I enjoyed about my job the most was the fact that everything was new, right? Nothing was repeated, especially in my practice. I didn't have I was, the securities lawyer. I did anything that kind of came in that was business oriented, right? The only thing I used to say is if it bleeds, I'm not working on it. That was kind of like, that's it. I draw the line. But other than that, business deals, and you're right, you just you become very expert in something. And then, as one of my partners said, it's like, the bathtub is full. You pull the plug and the only thing that's left is a little ring around it. And you're kind of memory oh yeah, I kind of remember something about that. But the most fascinating part was learning and becoming expert in it. And so my mentor when I was a young lawyer, still probably one of the most brilliant lawyers I ever worked for. And I remember this, it still lasts to me to this day. I think about this. He was taking the deposition of an expert accountant, an auditor. In and I think that the case had to do with with an earnout and how the seller had calculated the buyer had calculated the earnout and our client was entitled to some more money. And we're in this depot and he's just excoriating this renowned expert. And one of the lawyers on the other side said to my partner, my mentor, said, "Oh, I didn't know you had an accounting background." He goes, "Oh, no, I didn't. I was a philosophy major." He just learned it, right? He just was like, I am literally going to learn more about this one issue. Not like he was going to say, oh, I'm an auditor and accountant, but a very narrow expertise. He knew more about it than anybody in the room, right? And I'm like, that's what you have to do to be effective as a litigator, to your point. And then, as soon as that case is over, forget it, because that issue will never come up again, right? It's just a very narrow issue. So yeah, that and I enjoyed that, right? I kind of loved the idea, oh, this is a great case because I'm going to learn something about concrete. I literally had a case that was all about how concrete sets. It was fascinating. It's chemistry.
Yeah, I've always felt that the best episode of Jeopardy would be when we're just litigators on the panel. Because they would know all about these things that are obscure that they only had to learn once and then move on.
Yeah, totally worthless afterwards.
Yeah. So one of the things you've been doing, which is fascinates me as well, is how AI and the legal marketplace is changing so significantly. I wrote a blog the other day where I was basically saying that the legal profession in the past was really like an apprenticeship. You learned as an apprentice and then you worked your way up, and
Yep.
now AI may be destroying the apprenticeship structure. What are your observations? I mean, how are you looking at that from a dispute resolution standpoint and the training of young lawyers?
It's a great question that we're all wrestling with. I think from a training of young lawyers perspective, right? I said this to my son, who had actually, kind of studying computational linguistics. So he's kind of in that, field. And I said to him, people who don't embrace AI in their work and their profession, I liken them to the people who thought the Earth was flat in the 17th century. Like, oh, if we sail that way, we're going to fall off the face of the Earth. Like, no, Earth is round. Get used to it, right? AI's here. Everyone is going to have to learn what it does well, what it does not do very well, and be able to navigate through those two things, right? So, we talk about in litigation how it will hallucinate cases, right? You've seen you've seen all these. I don't know if you've read them, but there's been any number of judges who have sanctioned lawyers who wrote these AI briefs, and the AI just literally made up a case out of whole cloth, probably because it pulled from some source and it can't distinguish between a good source and a bad source because it's not very sophisticated at this point. So you have to check your work. You also have to become very adept at how to ask the AI agent what it is that you want, right? In other words, kind of the garbage in, garbage out. If you ask not a very good question, you're not going to get a very good answer out of it. So you have to be very careful about what you plug in and what you're going to get out of it. And then you have to also be very careful about checking your work. And so I'm sure you had this experience as a transactional lawyer, either as a young lawyer or managing teams of lawyers. When you had a transaction, the first thing you did is grab your form from the last one, right? No one ever started from a blank page. And you trusted that form because you say, well, I kind of know it. So if it was an M&A deal or if it was an asset purchase agreement or, shareholder agreement or whatever you were working on, you never started with a blank piece of paper, right? Even in the days before there was a computer, you probably had your secretary literally cut and paste it and then give it to a steno pool who would then put it down on a piece of paper, right? Now, I don't think AI is that different, right? In other words, it's a form, right? It's faster and it's probably a little better. But if that's all you did and you don't read it and question it and really kind of wring out every potential error in it, you're not going to be a very good lawyer. Same, we wouldn't have been good lawyers in our day if all we did was take the form and tell our secretary to change the names. Right? You'd be exposed very quickly, right? And I think because the AI form is very good and it seems very authoritative, that people are getting lazy and saying, okay, this is the answer. Like, no, it's not. And good lawyers, excellent lawyers are going to understand it's a tool to get to an even better result, right? And they will embrace it and learn about it. I don't know, will it ever get to kind of artificial general intelligence where there won't be a lawyer anymore? Okay, maybe. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know where that is, but I know where it is now. You have to be very questioning of AI. And I just wrote an article that got published the other day about in dispute resolution of saying, it's the third party in the mediation, right? Because both sides ran their case through, their AI agent and says, oh, it says I win. So now they're anchored, right? Or they're saying, oh, it says I have a 75% chance of winning and the case is worth $1 million. So I'll take $750,000 to settle. Okay, but not really, right? What did you ask it, right? What information did you put in, right? And that's only one variable in kind of the greater perspective in terms of what's going to happen. Okay, that's great, except guess what? The AI agent ain't the jury or the judge, right? So good luck, because that AI agent's standing up in front of the jury and arguing your case. So there's still many human elements that you have to overcome. So it's a variable in the equation. You have to understand it. You have to embrace it. You can't pretend it doesn't exist, but you have to learn what its limitations are, and being able to get parties to understand that while they may have an answer from an algorithm, how much can they really rely on that as truth, and how much of their own bias went into getting that answer because they're the ones who prompted it.
You know, your observation on it being a tool, I think, is critical, because so many people think it's not the tool; they think it's the answer. You know, it's sort of like, Google search on steroids is going to replace your brain, and that's where you see these mistakes made. You mentioned these law firms. There was an article which prompted my blog I did the other day, where a lawyer was sanctioned for $84,000 for using AI and having come, fictitious cases and the like. And I look at it and I say, well, okay, this is the experiment stage. There are going to be some people who are going to stumble and going to fall and going to get in trouble while they're using, but we all learn from that, and we get a better sense of how we use this tool as opposed to letting it replace us. My eye-opening moment with AI was, I'm in a book club, and they decided to review one of my books. They decided to do one of my books. So I said, what the hell? I'll go into AI and ask it to give me the questions and whatever I would do in a book club, so that they could, look at the book and I could ask some intelligent questions and everything. So it feeds back within milliseconds, obviously. It feeds back this whole list, and it had none of the characters right. It had the plot wrong. It was completely off base, totally off base. So in a huff, as a prideful author, I type back, "You have this all wrong. What's the matter with you? You made this all up," and it literally never gets obviously it never gets emotional back. They should make it get emotional back, by the way.
Yeah.
But putting that aside, it doesn't get emotional back and writes back, "Oh, I'm sorry. I have that problem sometimes because I have to answer the question. I cannot not answer the question. So sometimes I make things up." It admitted it. It confessed to its failure. And you're right. If you don't ask the right question, if you don't push it, it's going to give you nothing but garbage. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right that it is a fabulous tool when it's used correctly. It really is. I mean, I use it quite often when I'm doing like these, for example, this podcast, when I want to research somebody, or I want to sort of work on something about a particular guest. I just feed all that information about that person into the bot, and I get some great information back. So but that's just a tool. That's all it is a tool. But so
here's a great example where I think, like, from an efficiency standpoint, right? It would be great, right? I just thought of this, so maybe I'm off base. I don't know about you, but I hated timesheets. Just hated it, right? I hated everything about recording my time, right? Trying to kind of be accurate and tell a story about what I did, and client would look at it and it had to be there. I would think that would be a great, once you train it, you put your hours in and kind of what you did, and it'll create a narrative for your timesheet. Like, just like literally, like that just saved an hour of my day for a better product that everybody would like more, right? And then
you're right. Something like you were talking before we went on camera. We were talking about Otter, and so you could take Otter, turning into a timesheet manager. It listens to you all day, spits out your timesheet at the end. I have to laugh at that observation, only because when we were practicing together, you remember the firm used to have these incentives to get your timesheets in on time.
Yep.
That didn't work. So then they sort of, it wasn't so much of a fine, but they would hold something back, whatever. And I used to laugh at all of those things, because none of that was going to ever make me change the way I hated timesheets and got them in late, because I didn't care. I hated it so much. You couldn't give me enough incentive. You couldn't give me enough penalty. I was never going to change my ways with doing timesheets. But I think you've just hit on $1 million idea. Hopefully some listener out there will steal it and, go and create.
Yeah. No, say it would be the greatest, right? And that's the best. And then it does really good at, again, you could teach it in your style, or just a dumb cover letter or an email, in other words, you can just kind of put that on autopilot. But look, that's not why people are investing trillions of dollars into AI, but it's pretty good at that, right? And that's what I mean by embrace it. Like, use it and absolutely rely on it of what it's really good at. and use it as a tool in your practice to challenge yourself, but don't get fooled in thinking that it's the answer, has the answer. And I think in a way, I think it's a good thing for good lawyers, right? Because I think that the marketplace will speak, and lawyers who rely on it without questioning it are going to get exposed, right? And the cream will rise, and smart, good, hardworking, creative lawyers who learn how to use AI are going to be in high demand from their clients, and are going to be able to ask for premium fees, which is what it's about. And those who are just schlocky like they always would, or copied something and put it out there, yeah, you know what, you're going to get exposed very quickly.
I think that's a great observation to conclude on the AI area. Now, in the minutes we have left, tell us more about you suddenly decided, not suddenly, I'm sure it was an evolution. You decided that, okay, I'm going to now go solo, just me, just Stu, and I'm going to become a neutral. And what motivated that? And tell us more about how you're working with it, because it's only been since January that you've taken this new direction, and how you're finding it as your next career.
It runs the gamut. So how I got into it was I always loved mediation when I was a litigator. In fact, I would always tell my clients, nothing bad will happen talking to the other side. Nothing, right? You can always say no. So I was a proponent of mediation early, middle of the case, late in the case. If you had the right mediator and you came with an open mind, it was a really wonderful, creative process to solve a problem. And if you couldn't get a deal done, you would learn something about your case, you'd learn something about the other side's case that ultimately would probably be a very good tool that you could use at some point, right? And so I always told clients, let's mediate, let's go. Now, oftentimes, people are like, oh, kind of the same thing. Well, whose lawyer are you? Why do you think we're going to lose? Why do you want to mediate? I'm like, no, that's not the point, right? It's always worth talking, right? Even if it's just intelligence gathering, go. You'll learn something. It's a good use of everyone's time. And so when I was thinking about what was next for me, there isn't a practice where you're like, oh, go back to a law firm and I'll be the mediation lawyer, right? It's like, no, you're the mediator, right? And so I decided that's what I wanted to do, and then just kind of dove in, like everything, just gave it 100% and read everything I could read, brought my experience. I probably read as many books as I could read that are on mediation, took some more formal classes, talked to people who are mediators, and decided to set out on my own and kind of bring this full circle. Now I am embracing the Doug Wood book of marketing, right? All the things that I hated to do when I was a young lawyer that I said that I didn't do, and I'm reading your book going, yeah, where was Doug 35 years ago? Like, I needed Doug as my mentor. Like, nobody taught me any of that stuff, right? And what to do and how to do it. So I'm like, the love letter to young lawyers, but to old guys like me too, who are starting out something new, embrace it, right? Read Dawn to Dusk. I mean, it's all there, right? It's all there. And you don't have to do it the Doug way, but the lessons are all there, right? The lessons are there, right?
Well, I remember, I thank you for the compliments, much appreciated. But early in my career, when I started doing that, I rose into management of a law firm, a smaller law firm. And so I was managing now the law firm. And I said to my partners, why don't you try to think about doing individual business plans? And I'll never forget, one lawyer looked at me and said, what do you mean? Why would I do that? I don't need to do that. I know what I'm doing. I don't have to do that. I said, okay, fine. That's you can succeed that way too, but whatever. So now that you're a neutral in mediation, where does one find you? How do they find Stu Shanus today?
Oh, my website, which is Stewart. It's ShanusADR.com. My email is Stewart@ShanusADR.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Kind of publishing and putting my thoughts out there in terms of that, and trying to meet with as you said, as many lawyers as I can, because that's where the hiring really comes from, right? And so and it takes two to tango, right? So in some ways, the challenge is, when you're a lawyer, you're looking for a client. When you're a mediator, you're looking for two, right? So because both sides have to agree. So that's great. So now I made it exponentially more difficult to build a business. So good for me. But I'm embracing it and reaching out to the folks that I've had relationships with over the years. And I wrote a piece about this too. That's been the best part. Right? I think the coolest thing, I talked to my wife about this, whether anything comes of this from a business standpoint, the conversations that I've had with people who I hadn't talked with in sometimes more than a decade, sometimes it's been amazing, right? It's just been heartwarming. I got the nicest letter from a young lawyer who was like, you may not remember me. I was an associate on one of the teams you were running, and you listened to me, right? You were the only person who ever said, hey, what does this person have to say? I know she's only a second year, but come on, everybody speak up. And she goes, it always stuck with me that you kind of listened to what I had to say, right? And that meant a lot to me. I don't know if she's ever going to give me a piece of business, but that was the greatest wind at my back. I said to my wife, oh my God, I'm energized now for months, right? Yeah. That was just the greatest compliment. If some young lawyer said, you made a difference.
Yeah, when you occasionally in your career, and it can't happen enough, where you do come across somebody who remembers you and you had an impact on them, that's one of the greatest compliments you ever get. So that had to be a really great feeling. So to conclude today, so you've had a great career in big law, you had a great career in smaller business, and now you're on a new career in mediation and being a neutral. What piece of advice would you give to those lawyers we talked a little bit about it earlier, but what piece of advice would you give to lawyers who are torn in that decision on moving on and trying something different? What gave you the courage to do that 3 times at least?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. I'm almost fearful of giving advice on something that's so, important, right? I think it's such a personal decision, and I think you just have to kind of, like everything else in any big decision of your life, is look inward and really think about what it is that makes you happy. In other words, as you get older, someone would said to me, none of us get out of this alive, right? So, understand that, pursuing something that gives you some level of personal and professional satisfaction, and kind of always take inventory of that. And, is what you're doing now something that, that is driving you to that level of personal, and professional satisfaction. And sometimes it's a luxury, right? Those of us who have been successful and, haven't really had to worry about, mundane issues, about, kind of finances, it's a luxury. And I understand that not everybody has that opportunity, and sometimes, work's a 4-letter word because you got bills to pay. But if you can get past that, just be honest with yourself about what it is that you're truly enjoying and what is your level of personal satisfaction. And then I think once you kind of embrace that and accept it, the decision kind of makes itself.
Yeah, I that's fantastic advice. And I think your career is a great illustration of that. You started out in big law with the mix of all the administrative bullshit and all the stuff that dragged you down. And you had a love, though, there in your resolution of disputes or whatever, dispute resolution. And then you've held on to that. You moved into the private sector, still holding on to that. And now you've really gotten it full fruition to that's what you're doing every day. And you got the management headaches of being on your own and everything, but that's well worth the price of you having kept the thing you loved throughout the phases of your career. So I hope the listeners and the viewers really take that to heart, what you just said, because I think it was great advice. On that, Stu, I thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I think that there's a lot for people to learn from this discussion we had. And I'm sure they'll be knocking on your door to get their disputes resolved, because that's where they want to go. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Doug. I'm absolutely humbled, and it was a thrill to get back in touch with you. So again, if nothing more comes of this, then I had now 2 fantastic conversations with you. I'm putting it squarely in the win column. Loved every minute of it.
Thank you for joining us on the Dawn to Dusk podcast. You can learn more on building and transitioning a multi-million-dollar law practice in Doug's book, from Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. If you're interested in working with Doug, suggesting future guests, or have questions you'd like Doug to ask guests in upcoming episodes, reach out to him at douglas.wood@wood.law or visit his website at dawntodusk.wood.law. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your peers. Until next time, we appreciate your viewership.